Hi, Dr. Sabatino, and welcome to the Truth About Weight Loss Summit. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you
Oh,
for inviting me.
oh my God, it's my pleasure. I love talking to you, especially about this subject of which you are so knowledgeable. So, Dr. Sabatino, when it comes to weight gain, we often hear people say, well, it's because of my hormones. So, could you possibly give a brief overview of hormones? What are they and what role do they play in weight loss?
Well, it's interesting because hormones are really important chemical messengers in the body that are involved with regulating and controlling most of the function of the body, meaning our libido, our ability to handle stress, our ability to regulate blood sugar, our ability, in this case, also to regulate mood, and especially in the sense of weight loss, to regulate how we use calories and how we efficiently can burn them and how they play into how we regulate our own body image and weight. And really, it starts fundamentally, truthfully, with blood sugar. And this is very important because if you think about it, the primary source of energy for all of us is the sun. And there's only one thing on the planet that can directly take the energy from the sun and convert it into food. And that, of course, are plants. So on planet Earth, through the process of photosynthesis, plants create the carbohydrates that feed everything on the planet. So you basically have two choices. You can either eat plants directly, or you could make the really poor choice and eat something, eat those things that eat plants directly. So we cut the food chain down and we go directly to the primary source of energy, which are plants. But the interesting thing is that sugar, that carbohydrate, is required by the human body to produce energy. So when you take the energy, the sugar from plants, in the presence of the oxygen that we breathe, in all the energy factories of the body, in every cell, the mitochondria, we convert it into packets of energy. So sugar is primary, it's fundamental to all the energy needs of the body. But what's important, though, is that sugar is also a double-edged sword, because not only does it provide us with energy, but when sugar levels go above or below those basic levels that we need, it can be one of the most dangerous or toxic situations in the body. Think about people with diabetes, for example. What happens to them as their blood sugar goes up? There's premature aging. They lose their eyesight, they lose their hearts, they have their limbs amputated. So sugar can literally eat its way through the human body. So as much as we need it, we have to maintain it within a very precise range of normal. And so the body, in its wisdom, has a series of ways that we can do that, including hormones that help us do that. And fundamental to that energy dance is the hormone that we call insulin, probably the largest protein hormone in the human body. So when we eat sugar, the body will promote the production and the release of this hormone insulin from our organ we call the pancreas. And insulin will go into the bloodstream, this beautiful hormone that we have. And its goal is going to be to try to keep that sugar level within a very healthy range so that we have enough energy, but that we don't create a toxic outcome. And as it turns out, we can burn that energy directly in the energy factories. And the body in its wisdom also, if we have excesses of it, wants to try to store that for a future time of need. So in our liver and muscle cells, we can take that sugar in and store it as a starch that we call glycogen. And that glycogen, when we need energy down the road, let's suppose we're under stress or we're really pushing the body in physical activity, we can kind of pull on that energy reserve. It's almost like a savings account in the body. But to maintain that savings account, insulin that's released from the pancreas has to be able to drive that sugar into liver and muscle cells. And on the surface of those cells of the liver and muscle, and let's just take liver and muscle for an example, there's going to be proteins that sit on those cells of the liver and muscle that are going to be kind of like if you will, a lock for the key of insulin. So think about this. I tell people, think about insulin being a key that's going to go right into this protein lock that sits on the surface of these liver and muscle cells. And when that insulin key inserts in that lock, it turns that lock and it kind of opens a door in the membrane of those liver and muscle cells so sugar can now enter. So the way there's really only three things that are important for sugar being regulated in the body. And one is the release of insulin, the attachment of insulin to those locks, and then the opening up of the door on those cells so sugar can enter. Now, here's the important thing. There are a number of lifestyle factors, and one includes eating high saturated fat, like from animal products and processed foods, but also lack of exercise, sleep deprivation, chronic stress, those factors. All of those lifestyle factors, as different as they are, they basically have one thing in common. They change the shape, if you will, of the insulin lock. And that's very important because then think about changing a lock on a door and you try to stick the old key in it. It just doesn't fit. So now when you change the shape of those locks or even the number of those locks, insulin can't open the door of those cells and sugar can no longer enter. And when it doesn't enter, now sugar levels begin to rise in the body. But think about this. One of the reasons and ways and when that happens, when insulin levels are beginning to rise, your body begins to think that you're not producing enough insulin. So it starts overproducing insulin, but it's not effective. So that process whereby the body resists the natural attachment of insulin, it resists that attachment, and that's called insulin resistance. And we find that that insulin resistance is a byproduct dramatically of eating high fat diets. And this is very important because for the longest time, people with high blood sugar were told that their insulin resistance was being caused by eating too many carbohydrates, too many sweets, too much sugar, when in fact, of course, refined sugar is a problem. But the fundamental problem is that they're inundating those liver and muscle cells with too much fat. That fat takes up space. Now, sugar has no place to go in those liver and muscle cells. And so that shuts down those locks. So insulin can't drive that sugar naturally into your cells. So that's why, and this is really important because when that sugar level rises, because insulin's not working as well as it should, eventually, because the pancreas is being driven to overproduce insulin, eventually you can burn out those cells that produce insulin and you create the condition called diabetes. And it's very interesting to me that for years, the American Diabetic Association and so on would tell people not to eat carbohydrates and eat high protein animal based diets. To this day, that's still kind of the diabetic diet that is recommended by these organizations, when in fact, that's the very diet that reinforces the inability of insulin to regulate blood sugar effectively. And that's why we find that when you eat a plant based diet over time, those carbohydrates absolutely improve the way insulin works. You just got to get that high fat out of that diet, and especially saturated animal fat. So, the first thing that's happening then in that process is that you're seeing this insulin resistance occur. And here's the problem. When that sugar level goes up, we made the point in the early introduction that elevated blood sugar is very toxic to the human body. It can damage your organs. It can cause you to lose your limbs. It can create heart disease and brain disease. So, and things even like Alzheimer's. So as that blood sugar level goes up, the body needs to confront that and deal with that. And here's an interesting piece, that when we look at fat in the body, fat provides 9 calories of energy per gram of weight, whereas carbohydrates and protein are only 4. That's why in our model of eating plant-based, we talk about low calorie density. So when you're eating carbohydrates, they have a much lower calorie density, and we try to steer clear of really calorie dense foods like high fat. And even people eating nuts and things with higher fat, we recommend smaller quantities of those compared to carbohydrates like vegetables and fruits and grains and potatoes and things of that nature. But here's the interesting thing. Because fat provides 9 calories of energy when you eat it, it also provides 9 calories of potential energy when you store it. So one of the most energy efficient ways to store energy in the body is with fat. So get this, when blood sugar levels are rising, because insulin is not working effectively due to high fat diets or lack of exercise or chronic stress or sleep deprivation. The
Mhm.
body, in its wisdom, takes that potentially toxic elevated sugar and converts it into the most energy efficient material we have, which we store all over those parts of the body. So, in some ways, you could make the case that obesity is nothing more than the wise attempt of the human body to protect you against dangerous elevated levels, toxic levels of blood sugar. So the key there then is we want to not get rid of carbohydrates. We want to understand how can we improve that hormone insulin? What are we going to do to improve that? And there's another piece before we leave insulin, and that is the following. We made the point that elevated sugar is very toxic to the body. So it really becomes a chemical stress. You know, it's funny when people talk about stress, they have this sense that is only those psychological and emotional factors that we're being overwhelmed by in our lives. Stress actually comes in what I call the three T's: trauma, which means physical trauma creates a stress in the body; toxins, so chemical toxicity, in this case, super elevated blood sugar or environmental toxins, whatever that we're being exposed to. And then, of course, thought, which is actually the psychological factors. But all three T's create a stressful circumstance in the body. So if we look at elevated sugar following on the heels of insulin resistance, the lack of proper functioning of this incredible hormone insulin, we see that that creates a chemical stress to the body. But here's the important piece: regardless of the stress, whether it's trauma, toxins, or thought, the body deals with that by dealing with a fundamental fight or flight response, a stress response that's mediated by our adrenal glands. And we'll come back to this even a little bit more later. So the adrenal glands release a hormone under toxic stress called cortisol, another hormone. And cortisol prepares us for the fight or flight response.
Mhm.
But one of the interesting things about cortisol: it has a natural affinity, a love affair for fat cells in the abdominal region. And that's why that reactive pattern of weight gain that we see many times with abdominal weight gain, that visceral fat, is a stress induced pattern of weight gain. And we, in the body, there is a little enzyme that produces fat called lipoprotein lipase. It's a fat making enzyme. And it exists and sits kind of in little capillary beds right outside our fat cells. So if there's any fat or sugar going by excessively in the system, that enzyme, in a way, does this: come hither, and it will promote fat. Here's the important piece: that cortisol that's being produced because of chemical stress in the body due to high sugar because insulin's not working, that lipoprotein lipase is absolutely magnified and stimulated by the cortisol that's released under stress. So, under stress, your body predisposes you to deposit more fat reserves because it's kind of an ancient response to a time when we wanted to have storage of energy to deal maybe with long term stress, where maybe we wouldn't have food available over a much longer period of time. So we packed it on. But get this: not only does cortisol stimulate the activity of fat making enzymes, but it gets into our genetic machinery and stimulates the genetic production of that fat making enzyme. So the stress pattern, that cortisol, is triggering our ability to make fat on a very deep genetic level. And that's very profound when you think about it, because it's another reason why, and we're going to talk about this, why stress management becomes a very important part of weight control and weight loss. But for right now, I want people just to understand that from just this idea of insulin as a hormone playing a major role in keeping our blood sugar levels normal and storing it for a future time of need, and how things like saturated fat can block insulin's ability to work effectively. So now sugar levels go up, and then people think sugar's the problem when really fat was the underlying problem. But as insulin becomes less efficient and sugar levels go up, now you have a stress that triggers an adrenal response, cortisol release that drives abdominal weight gain. And by the way, that's the most dangerous weight gain of all. What starts to happen, it predisposes you dramatically to heart disease, cancer, things of that nature, and especially heart disease itself and diabetes. So the bottom line is, from our starting point, we see how the interplay of these hormones is so critical for, again, driving this initial way that we store energy and effectively put on and pack on weight. Right. So I don't know if you have any questions related to that.
Well, this is something that I'm going to definitely have to listen to again. But a couple of the things that I heard that I've heard before, which is so true, is that when people are diabetic, for the most part, their doctors will tell them to go on a low carb diet, not realizing that the problem isn't the complex carbohydrates. They're always thinking it's sugar. But yet, when we convince them to try the whole food plant based diet, they say, see, I ate a potato and my blood sugar went up. And then they get
Yeah,
scared.
because in the early stages of that, and think about that, in insulin resistance, you do have a very poor calibration of sugar. The sugar levels are high, so you're going to have carbs are going to add a little bit to that glycemic effect to even with a potato. But the truth of the matter is, as they really work with greens and all the veggies and that fat content of those storage cells like liver and muscle, they start to discharge that fat. Now sugar can enter those cells more effectively, and they don't shut down those insulin receptors as much. And so now insulin will start to work better. So initially, when I'm dealing with that, I will have people, for example, if they're going to eat fruit, I'll have them focus on things like berries more, but have it with celery and cucumber and romaine lettuce. I'll have them have it with greens in addition, and always have a lot of green vegetation and plants along with the potato or along with the fruit that they have. But in a very short time, you see that the carbohydrate, they have such a remarkable drop in blood sugar while eating carbs, and it's remarkable, and it always blows their mind. So even in centers like the ones I've run and other doctors have run that are based on just these plant-based foods, we'll see blood sugar levels drop sometimes several hundred points within a week on eating just a high carb diet. So you've got to get past that initial stage where you're still getting poor blood sugar regulation, and it'll pass in a relatively quick period of time. But it's all about the body allowing that insulin function to come back while it gets rid of that, a lot of that fat that's been depositing in cells from high fat intake. And it's a huge mistake to take people off of plant-based complex carbs. Huge mistake.
Right. Or never to give them a chance to try because, like you
Or
say,
never give them a chance to even see where it takes them. Yes, I agree with that.
because most doctors don't get much training in nutrition. And that's always the first tool in their tool belt is go on a keto diet, go on a low carb diet.
And it's important to realize that that insulin resistance is not only promoted in a dietary way, it's promoted when there is a lack of physical activity. That's why even regular physical activity becomes a very crucial part of people with weight issues, because not only for burning calories, but for helping to regulate the hormonal system of the body. It's also true of chronic stress. Stress management becomes important. It's also true of sleep deprivation. We could probably talk a little bit about stress and sleep. I think that would probably be worthwhile. When you look at the normal stress response, we made the point that when we as individuals encounter a threatening circumstance, whether it's a chemical toxicity within or some circumstance without, we have an inborn ability to resist and to deal with that stressful event, and we create a fight or flight response. And the fight or flight response is basically just what it says. We're able to either fight that situation head on, or the better part of valor may be to turn around and run away from it. You can fight or take flight. But understand that that response was designed for a very short-term response, a short-term survival response. And in fight or flight, if you think about it, what happens in fight or flight? Well, you have to prepare the body in a way to get as much energy into your muscles in the shortest period of time so you can fight or run away. So all the action of fight or flight is centered around getting that blood supply and oxygen supply into those muscles. So we see an increase in muscle tension. We may see an elevation of blood pressure. We see an increase in heart rate. We see a more rapid and shallow breathing pattern. We'll see a loss of appetite. The body is shifting attention away from the digestive system to make sure that you have the energy to fight or run away. We see a decrease in the immune function. We see a decrease in libido. All of those actions are part of fight or flight. And interestingly enough, if you think about what takes people to most offices on a daily basis, it's all of those things: high blood pressure, changes in cardiac function, changes in digestive function, changes in loss of immune system responsiveness. So, in many ways, people are running to doctors' offices on a daily basis to deal with the normal ways that the body is trying to prepare us to deal with stress. The problem is, in modern times, the stress no longer takes the shape of concrete tribes and animals of the past, where we could rise up to meet the stress and then move on with our lives. The stress now has become more of the gnawing, nagging, bitching stresses of interpersonal relationships, more abstractions of stress, so that we're no longer effectively dealing with that stress in present time. We now kind of get lost in the sorrows of the past, or we become more incredibly apprehensive and worried about our insecure future. Well, the past has already occurred. The future may or may not happen. So both of those kind of are an illusion. And the more we become disengaged from present time awareness, the more incapable we become of dealing with those stressful events. That's why many of the stress management techniques bring us squarely into present time, whether you're doing yoga or meditation or breathing technique. But it's important to realize that the body prepares for that fight or flight in a three-step process. It creates a chemical alarm where we become alarmed to the stress. And that's when we're releasing that hormone we call cortisol. And cortisol, along with the transmitters norepinephrine, noradrenaline, help us prepare the body for fight or flight. Now, that wouldn't be so bad if we just had the alarm. The body could deal with it and we can get on with our lives. But because stress has become more chronic, gnawing and nagging, we now have a more chronic release of cortisol over time. So the body now has to resist the ongoing nature of that stress. But as you're releasing that cortisol, what did we already say? That increases abdominal weight gain. Remember, it triggers the enzyme that makes fat, lipoprotein lipase. So the bottom line is now you're into a resistance phase. You're trying to resist that, and you're burning those adrenals out. You're getting them involved, your adrenal glands, and the hormones that the adrenals are releasing, like cortisol. Now, the body, in its wisdom, as it becomes strained and stressed, will recruit whatever help it can get. So, as that stress continues and goes on longer, those adrenal glands are going to start getting run down. Your body's not going to be happy and really efficient as that becomes more run down. So, it's going to try to recruit some help. And it goes and starts recruiting an organ like the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland now produces its own hormones that are going to help us, again, with metabolism, with energy. But if that stress continues even longer, we move from being able to resist it to a state of more chronic exhaustion. And when the body gets exhausted from being overwhelmed by long-term chronic stress, now both the adrenal and the thyroid glands become overwhelmed and they become less and less functional. And exhaustion is part of that kind of chronic fatigue, which in a hormonal sense is suppressing hormones of the adrenals and even the thyroid. And that's a very important piece, because when we get into that state of exhaustion, in our culture, we don't see the importance of rest and sleep. For many people, they just start using more stimulants, more coffee, energy drinks, a lot of that nonsense and they need to understand that whenever you stimulate the body in any way chemically, that stimulation is only an initial effect. Your body, as it deals with those substances of stimulation, has to now crash to the same extent that it's been stimulated. Whatever goes up has to come down, and it comes down with equal and opposite force. And so we have a lot of people on this roller coaster of stimulation and depression, and all they keep doing is, drinking more coffee, more energy drinks, which are not energy drinks at all. They're actually depression drinks because they're reinforcing exhaustion. But the problem is that pattern of reinforcing exhaustion reinforces a debilitation of the thyroid and adrenal glands and the hormones that they're producing. And here's a very important piece: those hormones produced by the adrenal and thyroid, especially the thyroid, are not only involved in energy production, but they are also involved in weight regulation. So as we become more exhausted and more strained from chronic stress, we find that we become less capable of taking weight off and less capable of keeping it off when we do take it off. And that's why we have to understand that there's only one real solution to exhaustion, and that's really sleep and rest. Not stimulant abuse, not supplementation, not anything else. We've got to reckon with that. And what's come out of all of this is that, the bottom line is sleep deprivation is one of the most biggest pandemics in our culture, and it's one of the leading causes of weight gain. And this is very important because I make a joke of this, but sleep deprivation or sleep is the only biological imperative and need that we tend to apologize for. If you go to a dinner party and I put out, or you come to my dinner party and I feed you and you eat it, you get enough to eat, you're not going to stand there and apologize for getting enough to eat. It's silly. But how many times where maybe you were resting or sleeping and someone awakened you by phone and you're on the phone and they perceive that maybe you were resting or sleeping and they say, "Were you sleeping?" And what do we do? "Oh, no, I wasn't. No, I wasn't sleeping. I don't sleep. I don't do that." So it's almost like we apologize for this such a biological necessity as sleep and rest. And the intriguing piece now is the field of sleep medicine has clearly shown that deficits in sleep are directly related to food craving and problems with weight gain and weight control. And we find that that bottom line for adults is about 6 hours of sleep. We really need at least that amount. When you start getting below 6 hours of sleep, there is a remarkable increase in the predisposition to produce heart disease and diabetes, for example. Children that are in growing phase need more. They need closer to 9 to 10, but as adults, we need about 6. So on a hormonal level, let's talk about something else. How, and why does sleep deprivation promote weight gain? And craving. Okay. There are at least 4 pieces to that story, and I want to share them with the audience because I think it's important. Number one, when you are sleep deprived, there is a remarkable increase in our good friend cortisol, that hormone that the adrenal gland produces under stress. So it may look like nothing to us, but the body's perceiving sleep deprivation in a way as if you're being attacked by a tiger. It's a major stressful event. And what does cortisol do? Again, it promotes abdominal weight gain. There's something else that's important too. When cortisol levels rise because of chronic stress and sleep deprivation, cortisol also has an impact on damaging healthy gut flora, the microbiota in the gut that is playing a major role in producing a whole range of healthy chemicals, this world that teems within us. When you have a lot of cortisol release, it shifts the integrity of that environment away from the healthy production, the healthy producing bacteria and fungi and so on in our gut, to more toxic elements. And that lays the groundwork for inflammation. And it also shifts it away. There are a whole population of bacteria in our gut that play a role in satiety and craving. People don't realize that our gut flora plays a role in how satisfied we are when we eat. And the fiber in plants that feeds the healthiest flora of our gut creates and stabilizes the flora that gives us positive feedback and really reduces craving. And that's kind of intriguing that we have organisms that help us in satiety. So the cortisol that's being released under sleep deprivation is playing a role, and again, promoting abdominal weight gain. When we are sleep deprived, there's an increase in the problem of insulin resistance. Again, our good friend insulin becomes unstable. And again, think about this, when insulin is resistant, you're going to have the inability of sugar to enter cells. And if sugar can't enter your cells, what do you think you're going to crave? Sugar.
Sugar.
So there's an interesting set of studies that show that when they have people that work on very odd, like night shift and shift workers that have these odd hours that have certain kinds of sleep deprivation, when they take people with sleep deficiency and they put out a food buffet with everything on it, from the good to the bad and the ugly, what's intriguing is people that are sleep deprived will gravitate to the most processed, refined sugar, high fat sugar, and salty crap under those conditions. So that sleep deprivation, that insulin resistance, and that cortisol release is programming people to really gravitate to the very worst foods for weight gain and weight regulation. And we see that. And so that's why that stabilization of insulin and cortisol becomes very important. You have a short acting hormone in the stomach called ghrelin that is the body's natural appetite stimulant. It's important. And so when we need food, this hormone is released and it drives us to go get it. Okay, so it's kind of an ancient hormone. But you got to ask the question, if all we had was that hormone, all of us would overeat until we exploded. So there has to be something that puts the brakes on. Well, there's a hormone that is released by our fat cells called leptin. And leptin goes back to the brain in a way, talks to the brain, and gives the brain the signal that we've had enough to eat. So ghrelin stimulates appetite. Leptin gives us the feedback that we've had enough to eat. In a way, leptin is kind of like a fat thermostat. It alerts the brain to the amount of fat that we're storing. And if we have too much fat stored, there's less, we have less, in this case, less leptin release. So the body will eat more, move less, that kind of thing. When you have a lot of fat stored or a lot of food that you've eaten, there's a leptin is released, it signals the brain for you to stop eating. Okay. So the bottom line is, this is very intriguing. When people are sleep deprived, there's a remarkable stimulation in ghrelin, the appetite stimulant, and a remarkable decrease in leptin that gives you the signal to stop. So in short, you don't stop. And we now know, we don't know all the causes, but just like insulin resistance, there's now a concept of leptin resistance, where people with weight issues are producing high levels of leptin that the brain is not, in a sense, recognizing, so that it's still provoking you to overeat, even though you have eaten enough or you've already stored enough fat. And we don't have all the reasons why that occurs, but we do know that processed, refined foods high in salt, oil, and sugar play a role in provoking leptin resistance as well as insulin resistance. It's another dance. So if you think about sleep deficiency, you've got high cortisol levels, it increases insulin resistance, stimulates the ghrelin, the appetite stimulant, and decreases leptin, the signal to give you the opportunity to stop eating. So that's why sleep deprivation can play an additional role in this whole idea of weight gain. So stress management and improving sleep are in some ways as important as the food and other lifestyle factors that we participate in to really regulate weight and provoke and promote weight control more successfully. Very important to realize that that interplay of all of those hormones are so important. Any questions on any of those
Well,
things?
not so much questions, but just to thank you for mentioning caffeine, because so many people think that coffee is benign because it has no calories. But just because something has no calories, because salt has no calories, doesn't mean it has no impact.
I mean, I have had people coming off of, with caffeine withdrawal in centers that I've run. I've had people coming off of cocaine easier. Caffeine is a serious mood altering drug, and it needs to be addressed that way. I know it's ubiquitous, I know it's everywhere, and I know people are lining up at Dr. Starbuck, to get that stimulation that they need. But the bottom line is you need to know that it can reinforce thyroid and adrenal exhaustion. And to me, that's fundamental again to having problems with keeping weight off or taking weight off. And I only lay this out because I think sometimes we lose sight of how simple things like how we handle stress and how we deal with sleep and where exercise comes to play and how stimulants like caffeine and sugar and things of that nature, they're having a major impact on that constellation of hormones that give us this remarkable opportunity to regulate everything in the body, and especially weight and weight control and even craving. And I hope that people can see how that craving process can be generated by obviously nutrient poor foods, we know that, but certainly by stress with cortisol, by shifting the gut flora in a way that becomes more toxic and is not being satisfied by the high fiber plant foods that we need, so that the craving for sugars and garbagey processed foods can become much more dramatic because you're favoring a form of bacteria that's not in your best interest, that's promoting inflammation. So yeah. So, any question or comment about any of that we want to develop?
There's just so many nuggets and there's so many areas I could go. You mentioned the thyroid briefly. What exactly does the thyroid do, and what role does it play in weight management?
The thyroid plays a major role in metabolism and energy production in the body. So, if you think about metabolism as a way to regulate calories coming in and calories going out, thyroid hormones play a major role in regulating that. And this is very intriguing. I think what if you talk to people, and I know you do and I do, it's almost a pandemic of thyroid problems. Now thyroid hormones are produced by the thyroid gland, and to produce those hormones, you need the amino acid tyrosine and iodine to produce T3 and T4, which are active hormones in the thyroid. And so the bottom line is we know that iodine is in need, and sometimes diets can be a little low in that. In our diets, we're recommending a little bit of sea greens or a little bit of dulse or something like that added to the diet, which would be helpful. But the thyroid, and this is intriguing though, the thyroid gland, like the other glands of the hormonal system, are affected by foods that promote inflammation. And this is very important. High inflammatory foods like animal products and dairy products keep a high level of inflammation in the body. I think different people have discussed this, but if you even look at the EPIC Oxford study, the European Perspective study, and others, they show people that are eating plant-based diets compared to more conventional diets that with more processed and animal foods can have as much as 50% less inflammation in their bodies. When you have the body being more inflamed, when you have the immune system reacting to antigens, the high proteins in animal products and things like gluten and so on, it creates a natural attempt by the body to attack body organs and body proteins. And so, for example, we know that there are elements in gluten that are similar to some of the enzymes in the thyroid. Or if the body's programmed against animal proteins, it can start attacking these glands in the body. So one of the things that came out of these vegan and vegetarian studies like Epic Oxford or the Adventist studies is that when people eat more plant-based and the inflammation is lower, that actually is the best diet for improving thyroid function. It's the best diet for improving adrenal function. And we've talked about this in the past, but people need to understand the power of plant-based eating for improving the glands of the endocrine system and the way they produce the hormones that help us regulate everything, but specifically weight loss. So getting that inflammation down, getting those high plant-based foods, getting those complex carbohydrates that are critical for helping insulin work better, working with a little bit of simple stress management, even 10 to 12 minutes a day, whether you do breathing work or whether you do a little meditative process. Get some more physical activity in your day so you sleep a little bit better at night. The serotonin and hormones that are reduced, that are increased with activity, can play a role in promoting better sleep dynamic, later on in the evening when you go to bed. So all of those things conspire, but it's very intriguing that recent evidence suggests that just a low inflammatory plant-based diet is probably the best approach for helping the thyroid, the adrenals, the pancreas, all to heal and take a better role in the way they produce hormones and how those hormones work.
What happens in menopause that seems to make it so much more difficult for women to lose weight? And do men ever experience anything hormonal that makes it more difficult for them to lose weight?
Well, estrogen, first of all, before menopause, estrogen dominance, which is promoted by high processed foods and animal diets, tends to deposit weight in thighs and abdomen and different areas that go on. And some of those dynamics, when you're shifting in perimenopause and menopause, there can be shifts in the ratio of hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, that can then trigger whether a loss of muscle mass or an increase in body fat deposition. So the key there is, again, interestingly enough, get involved with activity programs that include both things like walking and aerobics, but also some resistance training with weights. Get involved in really sticking to that plant-based diet that's got low in salt, oil, and sugar as much as you can, allowing that inflammatory level to drop down. Because remember, when you create that inflammation and you're eating that processed diet, you're creating the chemical stress, that chemical toxicity that is driving cortisol to increase abdominal belly fat. It's interfering with insulin from regulating blood sugar effectively, so sugar levels can be converted into triglyceride and fat levels. So, we talked a little bit about the dynamic of that, but truthfully, by really working with the dietary pattern that's really plant exclusive, plant only, without the salt, oil, and sugar, low in that saturated fat, you're giving that body a chance to reduce inflammation and chemical stress. You're giving a chance for those adrenal glands to calm down, for the thyroid to kind of resurrect itself, to allow the body to find a better balance. Get rid of stimulants. You got to get away from all the coffee and stimulants as much as you can. And then you've got to work on that sleep dynamic. And again, exercise helps that. Breathing work, stress management tools help that. People take drugs for that, and things like alcohol, and all these things do is they interfere with the deep phase of sleep, what's called the delta wave phase. So, you have this illusion that some of these drugs like benzodiazepines and alcohol are promoting better sleep, but they're really not. And in many ways, they can reinforce sleep deficits by interfering with the deeper phases of sleep that we need, that are going to be provided for better by routine physical activity, by stress management techniques and things of that nature. So I just want people to see kind of the big picture, the fact that these hormones are critical, but simple changes in lifestyle will affect these things in a very big way, to find a balance in that constellation of hormones that play a major role in regulating everything from sexual function to mood to weight loss.
Wow. So, what are your take on things like hormone supplements? Some people do injections or pills or creams, or are there a way to bring our hormones into balance more naturally?
I think what we're talking about here is what we're saying. Now, again, you can get to a point in menopause where you're not producing certain hormones. Let's say a woman is truly bottomed out with estrogen. Is there a place for biologically identical hormone replacement? There may be. But what I have a real problem with is, you got to understand that all of those reproductive hormones in many ways are growth hormones. They're hormones that kicked in puberty and adolescence when we were growing. So for women, when estrogen kicked in, breast development picked up, etc. So the bottom line is, when in your stages of growth, they play a major role. But as we get older, we don't need to grow anymore. And we find that those growth hormones, as you get older, if you're not growing, something's going to grow. And that can mean other cells, tumors, even cancers. And that's why, as we get older and we become more prone to, let's say, the cancer promoting effect of these kinds of growth hormones, reproductive hormones, the body naturally lowers their production. It actually knocks them down. So women become less estrogenic, all of those things are being knocked down. In a way, it's kind of a protective mechanism. Now, you can argue that there may be some problems that occur with that, when those hormones are dropping that way. But the fact is, when the body naturally, in its wisdom, is trying to protect us against some of the growth promoting effects of reproductive hormones, we come along and say, you know what, now we're going to promote anti aging. We're going to just pump you full of testosterone. We're going to inject you with this. The truth of the matter is, you raise testosterone levels, you can increase the risk of prostate cancer in men. It may not be the best idea. So I think a better approach is eating the way we're recommending, staying physically active, doing what you can. If you want to measure those hormones, you can measure them. But again, the body will regulate those to some degree regardless. For example, in women, if your ovaries are not producing estrogen the same way, uh, there's some estrogen production from the adrenal system, for example, and it may be just enough. So the real key is look at the symptoms, look at the action, but be wary of these approaches of just pumping, anti-aging hormones into the body, because they can be promoting some cancer generation in tissues and cells that you want to avoid if you can.
Wow. It was so interesting to hear you say that hormones can actually play a role in cravings, because this is what I hear from so many people. The difficulty in adopting a health promoting diet is dealing with these cravings.
Yeah, but like we already talked about it, even those simple hormones related to what happens in sleep, appetite stimulation and appetite suppression, ghrelin, leptin, insulin, all of those things play a major role in what we crave. And if they're out of balance, you're going to be craving all over the place. That's why the beautiful thing of eating complex carbs with all the high fiber and all of the nutrient density and the low calorie density is that they give you that sense of fullness without all the calorie density. So you're walking around feeling really satisfied at a nice low calorie level with a high nutrient density, because those foods have the highest nutrient content. So you're getting all of that remarkable benefit from those foods without all of that calorie density. So you take the other side of that coin, people are eating refined processed foods lacking in all the nutrients. They're getting fatter and fatter, craving more and more because the diet's not satisfying any of their nutrient needs. The flora in their gut is being incredibly damaged and starved. It's driving your craving for those foods. So all of that makes it almost impossible for people to stay on a good track. And that's why once you can give yourself that opportunity to move into this really good plant-based, nutrient-dense diet, you're going to find satisfaction. You're going to find weight regulation much easier. You're going to find a lack of craving. You know, a lot of those refined diets, you're spending time from, one time I went to a talk by this Emmanuel Taraskin. He was one of these guys that did a lot of work with vitamin C, and he was talking about nutrition. He said, most Americans take a glucose tolerance test for breakfast every day and they fail. They can't make it from breakfast to lunch because they're eating such processed food that the blood sugar levels spike and then they drop, and then there's craving and hormones are out of balance. So the bottom line is, you don't need to be sophisticated. You need to just, get on with eating this plant-based approach, all of this beautiful diversity of plants, fruits, veggies, complex starches. And what'll happen is that'll give you the nutrients, it'll give you the fiber, and it'll support the balance of the adrenal gland, the thyroid gland, the pancreatic release of insulin. All of that will be a byproduct of that. Get into some good regular form of activity. Take about 10, 12 minutes a day if you can, and do some stress response management, even if you just sit quietly, listening to music, doing a little breathing activity. Give yourself a chance to regulate sleep. Take a beautiful hot bath before bedtime. Make sure the room is dark and cold. Don't have blue or green lights in the room. Shut all that lighting down. We know that the blue and green lights spawn creativity and activity. If you have any light in your room, make it more of a reddish light. It actually stimulates more melatonin release from the brain, just that lighting. So simple things of that nature can help improve the sleep dynamic. But again, these simple lifestyle measures are going to help us, really regulate these hormones in a much better way.
You call them simple lifestyle measures, and while they are simple, I don't think for everyone they are very easy. You mentioned the gentleman who said that Americans fail their glucose tolerance tests every day at breakfast, and I hear from so many people that eat these refined foods, primarily refined carbohydrates, sugar, flour, usually mixed with oil, that for them it feels actually like an addiction, and they know
Well,
what to do, but they just can't stop.
it is an addiction. It's an addiction that is driven by the industries that are producing these super hyper palatable foods. Because what's happening is you get such a stimulation of the brain reward cascade. You get this release of transmitters in the brain like serotonin that give us and dopamine that give us that sense of pleasure and satisfaction and well-being. So now you're cranking the release of these transmitters up so high with these super palatable foods. If you try to take those away from that individual, guess what's going to happen? For a short period of time, they don't have that pleasure. They got to go through almost a withdrawal and a resetting, so that then they'll get to a place where simple things like we're recommending, good, sweet, pleasurable food. I tell people, if you take, like I just the other day, I had this incredible ripe persimmon. I love persimmons because they come out now. I defy anyone to give me any dessert or refined sugar that could rival the sweetness of that persimmon. But we don't think in those terms. We don't see fruit as being really the sweet. That's really supposed to be our sweet, because fruit is unbelievable. I tell people, it's the only food that you pick and eat without thinking about how you're going to prepare it. You don't think about sauteing the mango. You don't think about frying the persimmon. But the bottom line is, if you can, once you can get back into that, you can't go back to eating those processed foods. They're almost abhorrent. They just don't do it anymore. But these industries have fed and continue to feed people from the earliest stages with these hyperpalatable foods loaded with salt, oil, sugar, and the like, and it cranks up this brain reward cascade. With people like Dr. Goldhammer, Dr. Lyle talked about as the pleasure trap. It's very real. It's part of that brain reward cascade being jazzed up to such an extent that now you're on this unnatural high with these foods. And now you've got to really come down and give that body a chance to kind of withdraw and get past that addiction. And it happens. It will be, and you'll get to a place where you have a hard time looking back and thinking that's where you once were. But I tell people, you want to get past sugar, you've got to eat a good amount of good, succulent, sweet fruit. And you've got to get back into using it. If you want to eat it with greens and things, do that. But fruit is a natural, high, and really wonderful sweet component of our diet. And if you think about it, most processed food is fundamentally tasteless. It's just refined chemical content. So let me ask you a question. How many self respecting primates like us are going to pluck down our hard earned cash to buy this fundamentally tasteless crap? Nobody. But if you look at our taste buds and our taste mechanism, the sensitive areas for taste in our mouth are salt and sweet. So if you want to get people to pluck down cash to buy fundamentally tasteless crap, what do you think you got to add back to get them to buy it? Salt and sugar. So it's no mystery why those are two of the biggest additives. And then you throw in fat, which gives you that other satiety comforting effect. And now you've got the ingredient for a major cultural addiction that's going to feed those industries of destruction. And we got to break away from that. All the choices we're making now, every one of us, are choices that have become habitual over time. These choices we made repeatedly, and they've had a huge opportunity to weave their way into our behavioral tapestry in our nervous system. So as we make the new choices of food and activity and stress, those choices now have an opportunity to weave their way into our behavior. And I tell people, just give yourself a chance to let those new choices become part of you. There will be a time factor, and you've got to respect that, and you've got to love yourself during that time. And you've got to see and understand how you can create that sense of self-love and self-esteem while you're setting this new balance in motion. And it's within the reach of all of us. And that's where the mindfulness of stress response management is so important, where these techniques that bring us into more present time awareness about how we're eating. What does the food mean to us? Are we slowing things down so we have a sense of when we are full instead of just, rapidly? If you look at a lot of overweight people, they're overeating before the brain can even register that they started to eat. They're eating at such a pace. So we need to, bring ourselves back into some semblance of balance in our lives to become more mindful of what these things mean to us and how we can then give ourselves an opportunity to let them weave their way as a new pattern of behavior that is now fostering things in our best interest. I hope that makes sense to people.
Absolutely. You said about not eating these processed foods break through the addiction. But didn't I once hear you say that for every year we've had an addiction, it takes at least a month in recovery?
Well, in the real field of people that deal with addiction rehabilitation, they make two statements. One is, yes, when you go into like these 30-day programs, even if it's for food addiction, these are not really treatment programs. They're really stabilization programs. They stabilize your abnormal use so you can get on with treatment, and you'll begin treatment in these programs. But treatment goes on much longer than that 30-day program. And this one of the statements that they have made in these studies and in these programs is that you need like a month of care and treatment for every year of addiction. And that's something to give you the idea that it's not going to be something that's instantaneous. You have to have the sense that you need to have a little bit of self love and stick to itiveness, because there is going to be that little period of time. And the other thing that they talk about is once a pickle, never a cucumber again, which is another statement out of the field of addiction. Because if you have those addictive habits, you just can't play around with them. You don't go up to a heroin addict and say, you know what, I want you to shoot a $3 bag rather than a $5 bag. Still going to reinstate that addiction and craving. So there's a period of time where you have to get away from those things that are provoking that addictive process and give those new choices a chance to breathe in the pattern of your own brain and nervous system. And they will. And like all of us, look, I grew up in an Italian household. I grew up eating as much fat and cheese and sugar. I mean, we grew up doing all of that, and that was my normal way of eating and living. Now, looking back, I have a hard time believing that that's where I once was. And that's going to play for everybody. But you got to give yourself a chance to really understand what these things mean to you. What is it that you want to change? What's your goal in your life with weight and body image? Is it a legitimate goal? Is it a goal not based on some extreme body image thing that someone imposed on you? Is it a healthy image that really, so that your performance is better and you're not creating disease and breakdown? And can you create that goal? And what are the steps that help you create it? And how can you create a plan in your mind and in your behavior that gets you closer to achieving that goal? Sooner or later, it comes to the point where no one's going to do that for you. You have to, look at what these things mean to you, even food. Even what does eating that food really mean to you? And, it's like that old line from Socrates before he drank the Kool-Aid: a life that is not examined is not worth living, was his statement. Sounds harsh, but it's really about understanding, what is it that you're trying to achieve? And are the choices you're making getting you closer to that goal? But it's very important to realize that this is a very dynamic system. These hormones are always changing. There's a constellation. They're communicating between body and brain. The body talks to the brain in the language of hormones. The brain talks back to the body in a language of hormones through the neurological system. And the bottom line is that dialogue between body and brain communications ongoing, and it's affected by all the things we do, and especially by the foods that we're eating. I can't emphasize that too strongly. And those simple lifestyle choices, and I say simple because they're very clear. Sometimes they take time to engender. We got to get new habits. But the fact is, by setting that in motion, you change that incredible, flexible, plastic dialogue going on between hormones, body, and brain. And you can set it to the place that you want it to be. The power is within the reach of every one of us to reestablish that healthy outcome, that healthy balance of those very profound chemicals that we call hormones.
All right. So what you're saying is simple, not always easy, but it takes time, if I'm understanding you
That's
correctly.
right.
So,
And
Dr. Sabat,
you need to be patient and self-loving during that time. And I want to emphasize that. That's important to me.
so Dr. Sabatino, what is the real truth about weight loss?
The real truth about weight loss is that weight is just a byproduct of all of the sum total of the choices that we make. And when you realize the power that you have in your routine day to day choices and how you don't have to be a prisoner of those choices, that you are the actor, that you can set those in motion, you can see the consequences of those actions, and you can use those consequences to reshape those choices that give you the best possible outcome. So the real truth is that it is based on an important communication between hormones and other parts of the human body, but it's a direct byproduct of how we choose to eat, how we choose to move, how we choose to sleep, and how we choose to deal with the tensions and changes of our lives. And when you realize that you have a power to make choices within every one of those areas that are in your better interest, you will give yourself the best chance to really deal with weight and weight regulation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sabatino.